In 1990, William Steig released a picture book that centered around a foul-tempered ogre that accepted a quest to save a princess in a fairy tale world. A decade later, DreamWorks would come along and make a movie out of it, setting themselves up as the anti-Disney, using the franchise as a direct attack on the classic tropes of the Disney Renaissance. It would be hard to understate the success of the first Shrek movie as it grew into a juggernaut of a franchise, being in the top 20 highest-grossing series of all time, spawning sequels and spin-offs of varying quality, and, of course, the tie-in games. There have been Shrek games across 8 different console generations. Licensed games have never had a sterling reputation for compelling gameplay. If a game ends up good enough, it usually doesn't even come to mind when the term is used. There's no real reason even a licensed game can't be good, but usually there's either a lack of care from the developers, or, more commonly, a lack of care and time provided by the publishers and the holders of the copyright, which prevents these games from becoming their best. Obviously, they want to tie in products to release alongside the film to maximize profit, but I can't help but feel that speaks to a lack of confidence in the impact of your product and a misunderstanding of game development. Anything can be good if given the chance. So it sounds like I'm going to be defending this game and ending this video on a recommendation, right? No. Read the title. While this is a game I had way back with the Game Boy Color, it didn't play great even then, and time has not been kind. To start with, it's a fighting game without any form of multiplayer. That's not great, but if there was more here, it probably wouldn't even be worth bringing up. I play a lot of fighting games and mainly stay in the single-player modes, and I'm not the only one. A solid set of single-player modes can help train players for when they do decide to go online, and it lets you go back to these fighting games long after the rest of the community has moved on, or have something to do even if the community never picked it up to begin with. When the game first starts, we're given a list of choices. A practice mode and this game's version of an arcade mode. There's also an options menu where we can change the difficulty for the game. For a Game Boy game, this is actually pretty good. The practice mode is basically a requirement if you expect the player to learn how to play, since tutorials were a foreign concept to fighting games at this time. If this were a modern fighter, I would expect a combo list, a tutorial explaining the unique aspects of the game, and a mission mode going over the essential combos for each character. But this is well before any of those were standard practice, so I'll take the practice mode and be happy. There's no control list, but again, era of manuals. I couldn't find the manual online, and I've long since lost my copy of the original. I had to turn to GameFAQs to make sure I knew what I was doing, but more on that when we break down the gameplay. First, let's talk about the presentation. It's actually not bad for something on the Game Boy. Sure, I've seen a lot better, but I've also seen a lot worse. The menus are nicely detailed, the character portraits are almost low-res photos, and the character models are at least recognizable. Usually. The animation is stiff, but would probably be serviceable if not for the gameplay holding it back. The stages are diverse, with some simple background animations and a few of them to keep them from being entirely static. The music is surprisingly good, considering the game. At the very least, I never felt the need to turn it off while I played. There are a couple of unlockable characters as a reward for playing, a good encouragement given the single-player focus, and there's a unique system where you can unlock power-ups as you play through the arcade mode, which I at least appreciate the concept of. So far, the elements I've been talking about have ranged from good to serviceable, so why am I not going to recommend it? Well, I mean, you've seen me playing the game. It's very clearly not going to be winning any awards, but let's break down why. The animation isn't the only thing that's stiff. The controls are very rigid. Movement doesn't feel good, and you'll either slowly shuffle back and forth, or you'll try to jump and be rocketed across the stage without being able to gain control again until you land. The lack of control in the air is fine, honestly, but the distance jumping moves you means it's the primary form of movement across the stage, severely limiting your choices until you land. You can attack while in the air, but once you leave the ground, your arc is decided, and you're committed to that arc until you hit the ground again. So your choice, once you're in the air, is to attack or block, then wait until you can make decisions again. You can attack multiple times in the air, but it doesn't really amount to much, and if you try to use it aggressively, you'd likely find yourself filling every space around your opponent except the one that lets you get attacks in. It doesn't help that it takes forever to finish the arc. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a long time, but for a fighting game, it's an eternity. It doesn't help the arc of the jump is way too high. It's twice the height of the character, meaning even if you had chosen to attack, that decision is only relevant at the very start and very end of the jump. You can back away from your opponent to block, but that will likely lead to you just exchanging projectiles with them. Some characters have a crouch, but there aren't really any low attacks, so they can duck under some attacks, but it's fairly arbitrary which ones. So there's only a few options when you have made it to engagement range. Low attacks may be the bane of new players in fighting games, but they do serve a purpose. If there's only one choice for attacking or defending, then the player is obviously going to make that choice every time. Defense actually has more options here, with the block and jump. That means the defender will ultimately determine the pace of the fight, except that trying to take back the initiative will likely end in getting hit anyway. I mentioned that it's likely you'll just be exchanging projectiles in some matches. Most characters have the same set of attacks with a few minor variations, which isn't a bad starting point when designing a fighter, but more needs to be done before it can even approach being called good. The fact that the rate of fire for projectiles is one of the things that varies is particularly annoying. Most aren't incredibly egregious, but the Gingerbread Man is awful about this. There just aren't enough options for closing distance and re-engaging to make spamming shots from off-screen interesting. The shots lasting across the screen doesn't help. Then there's the biggest sin of the game. Hitting things and getting hit doesn't feel good. There's not really a combo system, so if you're close enough to your opponent you can't chain it into more moves, instead just using the same attacks over and over until the AI has enough points to activate an invincibility power-up, and then you have to worry about defending yourself from the same range without any good escape options. And you don't have the same luxury of the invincibility power-up for the first few fights. It's important in fighting games that a player that is on the defensive is given the opportunity to put the game back to a neutral state, giving them the chance to go on the offensive. It's why the ends of most combos in other games will put distance between the two players, and it's why being on the ground usually has some amount of mercy invincibility. It also goes back to having low attacks as well, since there needs to be a reliable way to get around a defender using the same tactic every time. There needs to be the potential for a back and forth. By having multiple options for attack and defense, fighting games have interesting decisions to make almost every frame. As for hitting things not feeling good, a recoil animation is standard for anything taking a hit, and knockback adds a feeling of impact to it. It does exist in minor amounts, but it's really unsatisfying. It's mostly just enough to stop you from moving forward, but doesn't push you back at all, creating a very tedious time trying to engage in the fight. A bit of a problem for a fighting game. It's more than just knockback though. No one has a flinch animation, so despite having an impact sound and a bright yellow sprite, none of it actually feels like getting hit. Actually, no. There is a flinch animation, but it only plays when hit by some attacks. Projectiles always seem to get it. Past that, there doesn't seem to be any rules about which attack will cause it, except that basic punches for sure won't. In case it needs to be stated, everything needs to have a reaction if you want it to feel good. With all that said, I guess the question for this was never going to be, should you play this as is, but rather, could this have ever been good without fundamental changes? If the only way this game can be good is to remove everything about it and make it an entirely different game, then we're not really answering in the spirit of the question, are we? The first thing we need to answer before we can seriously evaluate the game is, can a fighting game work on the Game Boy Color's hardware? Thankfully, we don't have to look too far to find examples to work from. There's an earlier game that I want to draw attention to called Power Quest. A lesser known game, but think of it as a proto-custom robo, but in 2D. Much smaller in scope, but an effective comparison for our purposes. Power Quest shows the Game Boy can support fighting games with all the trappings we're used to. High and low attacks, varying inputs, and even combos. So if Power Quest can accomplish this 2 years earlier, then what does Fairy Tail Freakdown need? The fastest thing to fix would be the jumping. It needs to be half the height and a bit shorter. Of course, changing that also requires speeding up walking. It doesn't need to be by much, we just need each option to be a viable way to approach the opponent. That would likely mean the stages would need to be reworked or have the ends cut off. I think that's fine, the risk of falling into a pit isn't really doing much to add to the game. We're going to try to avoid adding too much extra work because while the concept of adding time to the dev cycle is the ultimate point, there's only so much wiggle room you can realistically get for a tie-in for the first movie in a franchise. No one expected Shrek to become the juggernaut it did. So, can we still make it work without adding or changing the art too much? Unfortunately, we would need to add a flinch animation when getting hit at the very least. There's just no way around it. The game won't feel good until it's in there. We sort of have this already, but it acts as more of a stagger, and we may want to differentiate between the two. Thankfully, we don't need something as extreme as a multi-frame animation. A single frame will work just as well, and we can pause on that frame until the players are pushed back to neutral. Now that would be the other thing that needs to be fixed. Combos would be more engaging by default, but that would require more art for every character as well as code and a lot more testing. Thankfully, we can make do without a strict system. We wouldn't need to do anything as extreme as dive kicks one-hit KO, but if we're not going to have combos, then every attack should push the players back to neutral. But most characters do have at least 2 unique attacks, so maybe we could get some sort of combo going after all. If we have the character getting hit flinch on the first attack, then we could chain it like this for a simple combo. Simple attack to complex attack. Have the complex attack put distance between the fighters, but maybe allow time for one projectile to hit to reward mastery, and we have the beginnings of something resembling combos. We're almost there, but all the options are still on the defensive side. The attacker has more options for closing the gap, but since blocking will always work, the defending player doesn't have any interesting choices. One option to fix this would be to make aerial attacks ignore blocking the same way low attacks would. Since we haven't changed the jump arcs being fixed, the attacker still has to plan ahead and take risks, but now the defender is forced to duck in and out of attacks as well as block. That's alright, but we still need a little more. So far we set up a very defensive game, but we can encourage a bit of aggression by having slower moving attacks have more anti-air benefits, giving us a bit more interaction in decision making. Block beats punch, anti-air beats block, kicks beat anti-air. And one last change I would make is removing the invincibility power-up. The others can stay, but invincibility doesn't help the kind of fighter this game is trying to be. These are the changes I would make just off the top of my head without changing the fundamental structure or adding too much more to what it would have cost to make this game. But with these changes, we have something approaching a competent fighting game. The thing is, the structure for this game is here already. Even with a licensed game, the potential was there. No developer sits down wanting to make a bad game. And if there's anything to take away here, I guess it would be to give your developers time and empower them to make great games. It'll benefit both the game and the brand more in the long run. Wow, that was a lot to say about a very small game. If you want to see more, be sure to check out my channel. Also, I have a website where I also post these videos at misfitmatinee.com. More stuff is planned, I even have a prototype card game. Check it out. As always, like, comment, subscribe, Patreon, you know the drill. See you next time.